You have been lied to about effort. It is not discipline that creates, it is not force, it is assumption. God does not struggle. And if God is the doer, why are you exhausted? Neville Goddard cut directly through this illusion with a revelation so simple that it threatens the entire structure of personal struggle. He taught that God is the doer, and that the personality, the one you call me in daily life, is not the power that moves reality. The personality reacts, hopes, plans, fears, and attempts. But the doer, the actual operator, is something far more intimate and far more subtle. It is the I am. And when Neville spoke of God, he was not referring to a distant deity watching from afar, but to the living creative center within you, the very awareness that says I am before it ever says I am this or I am that. Neville often used the analogy of the vine and the branches, and this image carries a quiet authority when you allow it to sink in. The branch does not strain to produce grapes. It does not negotiate with time, nor does it panic about outcomes. Its only function is to remain in the vine. Once alignment is correct, life flows automatically. Growth occurs without commentary. Fruition happens without effort. The moment you attempt to take over the process as a branch, you reveal a misunderstanding of your role. The branch was never meant to do. It was meant to abide. This is where the word God becomes crucial to clarify, because so much confusion has grown around it. In Neville's teaching, God is not external. God is not watching to decide whether you deserve relief, love, or abundance. God is your own wonderful human imagination, the creative power that forms reality from the inside outward. Imagination is not fantasy. It is the womb of experience. What is accepted there, what is assumed to be true, does not need your supervision afterward. It moves into form by a law that does not ask for your help. Modern science has begun circling this same understanding from a different angle. Greg Braden has spoken about how reality self-organizes when coherence replaces control. When inner conflict quiets, systems naturally harmonize. The universe does not need micromanagement. It responds to internal order. When thought, feeling, and assumption align, adjustment happens automatically. Synchronization is not forced, it is released. And this leads us to the premise that unsettles the anxious mind but comforts the deeper self. While you are worrying, adjusting, checking, and rechecking, God has already begun regulating everything. Long before the personality tries to intervene, the law has moved. The bridge of events has already started forming. Conditions are already shifting, not in response to your effort, but in response to what you have accepted as true within. The work was never yours to manage. Your only task was alignment. And once that alignment is given, life takes over the rest. There is a subtle moment that almost everyone misses, a moment so normalized that it rarely gets questioned. It is the moment when desire appears and is immediately followed by effort. The mind assumes that wanting something automatically requires planning, pushing, correcting, and constantly monitoring the external world. This reflex feels responsible, even mature, but in truth, it reveals a deep misunderstanding of how creation actually functions. The instant you begin trying to make things happen, you quietly declare that something essential is missing, that the power you rely on cannot be trusted to move unless you interfere. Personal effort in this context is not neutral. It carries a signal. It signals mistrust in the operant power, mistrust in the intelligence that governs cause and effect. When you strain, when you push, when you obsessively adjust, you are not accelerating the process. You are introducing friction. Consciousness does not respond to force, it responds to assumption. The more you struggle, the more you remain identified with the role of the personality, and the personality was never designed to operate reality. It can only observe it after the fact. The sensation of effort often disguises itself as productivity, but energetically it resembles interference. Imagine reaching for the steering wheel while the car is already on autopilot, not because the system is failing, but because you cannot tolerate the silence of not being in control. In that moment, your grabbing does not improve direction, it destabilizes it. The system was already calculating speed, distance, and timing with a precision far beyond conscious thought. Your interruption does not help the journey, it disrupts it. This is why so many people experience delay, contradiction, and exhaustion precisely when they try the hardest. They assume intensity equals effectiveness, yet the law responds to clarity, not strain. The more you attempt to manage the unfolding, The more you confirm internally that it is not already handled, that confirmation becomes the assumption, and the world faithfully reflects it back as resistance. When this is truly seen, a quiet question begins to arise, not as an intellectual puzzle but as an inner turning point. If effort interferes rather than assists, if control slows rather than speeds, then what actually allows movement? What is it that causes reality to shift when nothing appears to be happening on the surface? That question does not demand an answer through action. It opens the door to a deeper reversal, one where power is reclaimed not by doing more, but by stepping out of the way. At a certain depth of understanding, something begins to turn inside you, almost imperceptibly at first. The old logic that said movement requires effort starts to dissolve, and in its place arises a quieter recognition. Reality does not respond to struggle, it responds to state. This is the great reversal Neville spoke of, the moment when creation is no longer something you chase, but something that follows you. Consciousness, once assumed, does not wait for permission to act. It moves immediately, silently, and without strain. The power that animates experience does not announce itself, nor does it require emotional intensity to function. It operates with the same neutrality that governs breath, heartbeat, and growth. When a state is assumed, the law accepts it as a command, not because you are forceful, but because assumption is agreement. Consciousness rearranges itself around what is taken as true. No tension is required, just as no tension is required for gravity to operate. The movement is inherent. This is why Neville emphasized that feeling is the secret, not feeling as emotion, but feeling as knowing. When something is assumed, it is no longer desired. It is no longer pursued. It is mentally placed in the category of so. The moment that happens, the creative act is complete. Everything that follows is adjustment, not effort. The personality may still be present, but it is no longer the engine. It becomes the witness to a process already in motion. A helpful way to sense this is to observe how a thermostat regulates a room. It does not debate the temperature, nor does it panic when the air feels warm or cold. Once set, it quietly adjusts conditions without commentary. It does not require supervision. It does not check in for reassurance. It simply responds to the assumption embedded in its setting. Consciousness functions the same way. Once the inner setting is accepted, the outer world begins to shift accordingly, without noise, without urgency, and without your involvement. What makes this difficult for the personality to accept is the immediacy of it. The action does not wait for visible proof. The law does not require validation from the senses before it begins. The adjustment starts the moment the state is assumed, not the moment it appears on the screen of experience. This is why impatience so often sabotages results. It tempts the mind to reassert control, just as the invisible work is underway. When this reversal is understood, there is a subtle relief that enters the system. You are no longer attempting to move reality forward. You are allowing reality to catch up to a decision already made within. The effort dissolves because it is no longer necessary. The doing is no longer yours. And in that release, the true operator resumes its natural function, adjusting everything with a precision that effort could never achieve. If this is already resonating, stay aligned here. Subscribe, and let these truths keep unfolding. As understanding deepens, a more precise distinction begins to emerge, one that changes how you relate to every inner movement. When Neville said that God is the doer, he was not suggesting that nothing happens within you, but that the role you have been playing has been misunderstood. The personality believes it creates through action, repetition, and effort, yet its true function is far quieter. It does not generate reality, it consents to it. Creation happens at a level beneath personal will, and the moment that is seen, much of the inner conflict begins to dissolve. Consent is subtle. It does not look like force or discipline. It looks like acceptance. When something is assumed to be true, the personality has already signed its approval. There is no need to argue further, because the decision has been made at the level that matters. The mistake has never been a lack of action, but a lack of agreement. As long as the inner state remains undecided, fragmented, or contradictory, the law has nothing stable to move upon. Neville often implied that imagination issues the command and life executes it. The personality's role is not to manage the execution, just as a person does not oversee every line of code once a system has been approved. You sign off, and the system runs. You do not hover over it, correcting each function in real time. The more you attempt to interfere, the more you reveal doubt in the very system you authorized. True power does not hover, it allows. This is why effort so often feels heavy. It is not aligned with the actual mechanism of creation. Effort belongs to the personality, and the personality operates in time, sequence, and limitation. Consent belongs to consciousness, and consciousness operates outside of strain. Once consent is given internally, action is already complete in principle. What remains is simply the unfolding. This also explains why physical action, when it does occur, feels different after alignment. It is no longer frantic or compulsive. It arises naturally, without inner debate. The difference is not in what is done, but in where it comes from. Action that flows from consent feels inevitable, not forced. It carries no anxiety, because it is no longer attempting to make something happen. It is simply part of what is happening. Understanding that consent is given internally, not through visible effort, removes the false burden of control. You are not responsible for arranging outcomes. You are responsible for agreement. Once that agreement is established, the doer resumes its role, and the personality, relieved of a task it was never meant to perform, finally rests in its proper place. Once the need to manage outcomes loosens its grip, a different quality of movement becomes noticeable. Life begins to arrange itself in ways that feel precise, yet unforced, as though an unseen intelligence were quietly coordinating details long before you become aware of them. This is what Neville described as the bridge of incidents, not a dramatic chain of events designed to impress the senses, but a subtle orchestration that carries you naturally from assumption to fulfillment without requiring your supervision. Synchronization does not announce itself with fireworks. It often appears ordinary on the surface, almost disappointingly so. A conversation happens at the right moment. A delay redirects you. A decision you did not consciously plan feels suddenly obvious. When viewed in isolation, these moments seem incidental. When viewed in retrospect, they reveal an unmistakable coherence. Each step connects seamlessly to the next, not because you planned them, but because the end was already accepted internally. The mind tends to look for control through anticipation, believing that foresight equals safety. Yet the law operates in reverse. It moves from the accepted end backward, arranging conditions in ways the personality could never predict. This is why trying to plan the middle often creates resistance. You are attempting to map a route that is already being calculated from a level beyond linear thought. The more you trust that calculation, the more effortless the unfolding becomes. An apt image is that of clock gears moving invisibly behind the face. From the front, all you see is the smooth progression of hands. There is no indication of the intricate coordination happening beneath the surface. The gears do not ask for approval, nor do they pause for commentary. They move because they are aligned. Consciousness functions in the same way. Once a state is assumed, the inner mechanism begins its work, adjusting timing, encounters, and sequences with quiet precision. What often unsettles the personality is the subtlety of this process. It expects drama as proof of effectiveness. It looks for struggle as evidence of progress. Yet true synchronization feels almost anticlimactic. There is less urgency, not more. Fewer emotional spikes, not constant excitement. The coordination feels natural, even obvious, as if things could not have happened any other way. This subtlety is not a flaw, it is the confirmation. When events line up without your planning, without your anxiety, and without your effort, it reveals that regulation is already underway. Life does not need instructions, it needs permission. And once that permission has been granted through assumption, everything required begins to take its place, quietly, efficiently, and on time. There comes a point in this understanding where effort does not merely feel unnecessary, but intrusive. The mind begins to recognize that its constant vigilance has not been a form of responsibility, but a refusal to rest. Neville pointed to the state akin to sleep as the natural threshold where this vigilance loosens, where personal will softens enough for a deeper intelligence to resume control. SATS is not a technique to force results. It is a condition in which the personality steps aside and allows the creative power to function without interference. In this state, the senses lose their authority. The world grows dim, not because it disappears, but because it is no longer being consulted. Attention turns inward, not in concentration, but in surrender. This is why sates feels restorative, even before any result appears. It mirrors the moment at the end of a long day when tools are set down, not because the work failed, but because the work is finished. There is nothing left to manage, nothing left to adjust. The burden dissolves. Neville emphasized this state because it naturally bypasses the habit of control. When the body relaxes and the mind drifts, the personality loses its grip on sequencing, logic, and vigilance. In that softness, assumptions pass unchallenged. They are no longer interrogated by reason or contradicted by the senses. What is felt there is accepted without resistance, and what is accepted there is impressed upon consciousness as fact. Yet this is also where a quiet tension can arise. After surrender, the senses attempt to reclaim authority. They return with reports, comparisons, and reminders of how things appear. The mind, accustomed to management, feels uneasy in the absence of effort. It searches for signs that something is being done. This is not failure. It is the echo of an old identity losing its role. The discomfort does not mean nothing is happening. It means control has been released. SATS represents a transfer of authority. The personality, which has been overworking, finally yields to the doer. And once that transfer is made, regulation begins without noise. Adjustments happen beneath awareness. Timing recalibrates. Conditions reorganize. The work proceeds without supervision. This is why Neville spoke of sleep as sacred, not because it is mystical in itself, but because it restores the proper order. In sates, you are no longer the manager of outcomes. You are no longer negotiating with time. You are resting in a decision already made. And in that rest, the doer resumes its function, carrying the assumption forward into form with an ease that effort could never replicate. As regulation begins to operate without conscious effort, an unexpected resistance can surface, not from external circumstances, but from identity itself. The personality has long defined its value through struggle, vigilance, and problem-solving. When these are no longer required, a quiet panic can arise. The ego does not fear failure as much as it fears irrelevance. It has built its sense of self around being needed, and when life starts to move without its constant involvement, that identity feels threatened. This attachment to struggle is subtle because it often disguises itself as responsibility. The mind insists that without effort things will fall apart, that attention is what keeps order intact. Yet this belief is learned, not inherent. It was reinforced by years of associating control with safety. When that control is withdrawn and nothing collapses, the ego does not feel relieved, it feels displaced. Its familiar role is no longer being called upon. An image that captures this well is that of a manager who suddenly realizes the system runs perfectly without them. At first, there is disbelief, then suspicion, then anxiety. If the system does not need constant oversight, what purpose does the manager serve? The ego reacts in the same way. It searches for new problems, new worries, new adjustments to justify its presence. It attempts to reclaim authority, not because something is wrong, but because it does not know how to exist without interference. This is where many people misinterpret inner unrest. They assume unease means alignment has been lost, when in fact it often means alignment has been achieved. Peace feels unfamiliar to an identity trained in effort. Stillness can feel like danger to a mind accustomed to motion. The absence of urgency is mistaken for neglect, even though it is the very sign that authority has been properly transferred. Over time, a different recognition begins to emerge. The ego does not disappear, but it is recontextualized. It no longer governs creation. It becomes a functional tool rather than a controlling force. Thought becomes useful instead of compulsive. Attention becomes responsive instead of anxious. The inner manager steps back, not because it has been fired, but because it was never meant to run the system. Peace, in this sense, is not passivity. It is confirmation. It confirms that the doer is active, that regulation is underway, and that interference is no longer required. When this is understood, the fear of becoming unnecessary gives way to relief. The struggle ends not because something was fixed, but because it was no longer needed in the first place. There is a profound difference between solving a problem and witnessing its resolution, and that difference becomes clear only when control has truly been released. Solving implies confrontation. It assumes resistance, an opposing force that must be analyzed, attacked, and overcome. Regulation, however, operates on an entirely different principle. It does not argue with conditions. It does not focus on symptoms. It simply restores balance, and in doing so, the problem loses its reason for existing. Neville hinted at this when he spoke of correction rather than struggle. When consciousness shifts, the outer situation does not need to be battled into submission. It adjusts naturally, just as a body heals itself without instruction. You do not tell cells how to regenerate. You do not supervise the closing of a wound. Once the proper conditions are present, the intelligence within the system takes over. Healing is not dramatic. It is quiet, methodical, and often unnoticed until it is complete. This is why many manifestations feel anticlimactic when they arrive. There is no explosion of triumph, no emotional crescendo that signals victory. Instead, there is a sense of normalcy, as though things simply returned to where they were always meant to be. The mind expects resolution to feel like conquest, yet regulation feels like relief. The tension dissolves not because it was defeated, but because it was no longer supported by the inner state. When problems resolve rather than being solved, there is no residue of struggle left behind. No story of battle remains to be retold. The issue fades quietly from relevance, and attention moves on without needing closure. This is deeply unsettling to the ego, which thrives on narrative and conflict, but deeply comforting to consciousness, which recognizes harmony as its natural condition. Stillness is the hallmark of true regulation. When something has been corrected at the root, there is no urgency to discuss it, analyze it, or guard against its return. The system is at ease. Excitement would imply instability. Relief implies order. The absence of emotional charge is not indifference. It is confirmation that balance has been restored. Understanding this reframes how change is recognized. You stop looking for signs of struggle as evidence of progress. You stop equating intensity with effectiveness. Instead, you begin to notice the quiet disappearance of what once demanded attention. Problems lose their weight. Situations untangle themselves. And in that calm resolution, it becomes clear that regulation has been working all along, unseen, unannounced, and uninterrupted. When regulation is fully underway, a subtle shift in identity takes place. You are no longer positioned at the center of events as their manager, but at the edge of them as their observer. This does not create distance from life. It creates clarity. To live as witness is not to withdraw or detach, but to recognize that the movement of reality does not require your commentary. It unfolds with or without narration, and in that unfolding, your role becomes simpler and more spacious. Neville spoke of this witnessing as a natural consequence of faith, not faith as belief, but faith as rest. When the inner decision has been made, there is nothing left to supervise. Attention relaxes. The mind stops scanning for confirmation. Life is allowed to complete its own sentences. This witnessing does not feel passive, it feels settled. There is an underlying sense that something is already in motion and that your interference would only disrupt its course. An image that captures this well is watching a river make its way to the ocean. The water does not need encouragement. It does not require direction. It responds to gravity, to terrain, to laws far older than any observer. You could stand at the riverbank and worry about its path, but your concern would not change its destination. In the same way, once a state has been assumed, reality begins moving toward its expression without asking for your assistance. What often surprises people at this stage is how little effort it takes to remain in this position. The personality expects witnessing to require discipline, yet it arises naturally when trust replaces control. The mind may still comment, but its commentary loses urgency. Thoughts pass without attachment. Sensations arise without interpretation. You are present, but no longer entangled. In this mode of being, timing reveals itself without anxiety. You notice that things arrive when they are needed, not when they are demanded. Delays no longer feel like obstacles, they feel like part of the flow. Outcomes no longer feel fragile, they feel inevitable. This does not create complacency. It creates confidence rooted in alignment rather than prediction. Living as witness ultimately reveals the truth. that effort once concealed. The work was never incomplete. It was never waiting for your permission to finish. By stepping back, you do not abandon creation. You allow it to conclude in its own way. And in that allowance, the deeper intelligence you once tried to manage is finally free to complete what it began. What remains when every explanation has done its work is not complexity but clarity. Neville's truth does not require elaboration to be powerful, yet it deepens as it is contemplated. When you assume God acts, this is not a poetic suggestion or a motivational phrase. It is a statement of law. The moment a state is inwardly accepted as true, movement begins automatically. Not because you have earned it, not because conditions approve of it, but because consciousness cannot remain idle once it has been impressed. This understanding quietly dismantles one of the most deeply rooted habits of the personality, the belief that effort is the cause of results. For years, effort may have seemed necessary, even noble. Struggle appeared to prove sincerity. Anxiety masqueraded as care. Yet when seen clearly, none of these were creative forces. They were reactions to uncertainty. They arose from the assumption that life was unresponsive unless pressured. The moment alignment replaces that assumption, effort is revealed as unnecessary and often counterproductive. Alignment is not something added to life, it is something restored. It is the natural state that exists when inner contradiction dissolves, when you are no longer divided between what you desire and what you expect, between what you imagine and what you fear. Coherence settles in. In that coherence, reality reorganizes itself, not dramatically, not urgently, but efficiently. The law does not rush and it does not hesitate, it simply adjusts. Neville's mirror analogy remains one of the clearest ways to grasp this. You do not correct a reflection by arguing with it, blaming it, or forcing it to change. You adjust the image and the reflection follows automatically. The outer world is no different. It reflects the inner state with absolute fidelity. To work endlessly on appearances is to misunderstand cause. To change the state within is to address the only level where real change occurs. This is why effort eventually exhausts itself. It tries to solve a reflection while leaving the image untouched. It tries to regulate effects while leaving the cause in conflict. Alignment, by contrast, feels relieving, not because it promises instant gratification, but because it restores order. When the image is set, the reflection has no choice but to comply. The work is finished at the level that matters, even if the senses have not yet caught up. Modern language has begun to echo this ancient insight. When coherence is present, systems self-organize. Intelligence does not need instructions when there is no internal interference. Outcomes align not because they are forced, but because they are allowed. Regulation is not something you initiate through willpower. It is something that happens when inner resistance falls away. Life knows how to balance itself when it is not being contradicted. This is why stillness often accompanies real change. There is no emotional frenzy, no sense of chasing. Instead, there is a quiet knowing that something is already underway. The mind may not be able to track the sequence, but it no longer needs to. Trust replaces vigilance. Observation replaces management. You are not waiting for life to respond. You are witnessing it unfold. Entering the state akin to sleep reflects this understanding perfectly. It is not an escape from responsibility, but a return to the correct distribution of roles. The personality rests because its task is complete. The doer takes over because it always has. In that rest, imagination impresses consciousness without resistance, and consciousness moves reality without effort. Nothing needs to be forced. Nothing needs to be monitored. Over time, this produces a different relationship with experience itself. Events no longer feel fragile, as though one wrong thought could undo them. Timing no longer feels threatening, as though delay implies denial. Life feels steadier, quieter, more ordered. Not because problems never arise, but because they no longer demand struggle to resolve. They adjust, dissolve, or fall away as coherence is maintained. And so the final understanding is not dramatic. It is simple, grounded, and deeply stabilizing. You were never meant to carry the weight of orchestration. You were never meant to manage timing, coordination, or outcome. Your role was always consent. Once that consent is given internally, everything else proceeds according to law. Let God be God. Let the doer do. What has been assumed is already acting. What has been aligned is already regulating itself, and what you once tried to manage so carefully is now being handled with a precision far beyond effort, quietly, faithfully, and completely.